So our screencast today is going to be based off of what we talked about earlier today in class about how dominant the ancient Egyptians were, but I wanted to kind of cover why that was. And so the question I'm going to pose to you before we get started is, before current technology, how did civilizations come to power? And so I have given all of you a blank template of this mural. And so as we go through, just go ahead and kind of fill it out. And I will have a filled out option in class as well for those who might not get to it. So we are going to be focusing specifically on the Nile River and kind of how it played a part in ancient Egyptians coming into power and becoming such a dominant civilization. So to begin with, why was it so important? So the first, probably most obvious answer would be it's available drinking water. So Egypt is it is in the desert, so it's really hot. There's not a lot of water sources. So to have a river nearby is essential to survival. It also provided a really convenient food source in the fish, and we'll get to it later, but also the flora and fauna surrounding the river were also options for them. But most importantly, what made it stand out was that it nourished the soil around, and the ancient Egyptians really began to utilize the water source as something more than just kind of a water and a food source. So we have irrigation. The ancient Egyptians really introduced irrigation, and so this allowed them to expand outward off of the riverbank. So this led to farming, which led to animals and crops. So they were able to accumulate kind of like a wealth of animals and crops, which hadn't really been seen before. And so since they weren't necessarily limited to like the riverbed, they were able to expand their population and grow like onward, upward, outward, everything. So the nourishment of the soil also led to, I mentioned this before, the surrounding flora and fauna. This not only was like a food and water source, but it also provided a unique trade opportunity, which we will talk about in the next section. But because of their kind of rare flora and fauna in their area, they were able to kind of use what they had to trade, to sell, all of that, kind of with other people nearby, and so this just provided them with another advantage. So again, as I mentioned, they used the river for transportation. So this allowed them to travel farther safely. It's really hard to travel in the desert, obviously, especially when it's really hard to kind of pack and carry water for long periods of time. And so those boats and rafts and everything allowed them to travel farther. So with that, they sold whatever goods they had. So a lot of time they had papyrus, which was made into paper. We talked about that. They also, they had an accumulation again of like wheat and reeds and all of that. And then they would trade the goods for other things. So it wasn't necessarily a sale, but they got something in return and gave something. And then another kind of big one would be exchanging information with other people. So this allowed for more ideas to flow. A lot of other people benefited from this exchange because they were able to kind of hear about things like irrigation, which led to the massive expansion that did become the ancient Egyptian civilization. So what did the Nile River allow the ancient Egyptians to do? So the overall concept of everything that the Nile allowed them to do was to turn their population of maybe a few into an entire civilization that would go on to dominate the area for decades and decades and decades. So the question that I'm going to leave you with is, how important is geography to us now? And what are some features surrounding us that we can kind of maybe relate to the Nile River? Like, what would our Nile River be today?